The last word Ellie Hayes heard from her editor was gone. It cut through the air sharper than the Montana wind whipping through Helena's streets. The door to the newspaper office clicked shut behind her, sealing her off from the clatter of the printing press, the smell of ink, and the only paycheck she'd ever known. She pulled her thin shawl tighter, the cold a physical weight on her shoulders. It wasn't just the cold she feared. It was the silence in her coin purse, the emptiness of the bread box, the rattling of the last few pills in her mother's medicine vial. Each step through the deepening snow was a step closer to ruin. The world was a blizzard, and she was walking right into the heart of it. Then, through the swirling white, she saw them, huddled under the awning of a saloon long since boarded up. A man and a little girl. His coat was threadbare, his shoulders slumped, but he held the child to his chest like she was the last flame in a dying world. The girl, no older than 4, shivered in a faded dress, her lips a faint blue. She wasn't even crying. She was too weak for that. Ellie had seen men broken by the frontier before, but this was different. There was a hard set to the man's jaw, a stubborn dignity in the way he shielded his daughter from the wind. He wasn't begging. He was surviving, and just like that, everything changed. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, a ghost from a warmer time. When you've got nothing left to give, Ellie, that's when your kindness matters most. She looked down at her satchel, a heel of bread, the precious medicine, a few coins that wouldn't last the week. It was next to nothing, but it wasn't nothing. She took a step forward, the snow crunching under her worn boots. The man's head snapped up. His eyes were steel gray, weary but watchful. He pulled the child closer, a silent warning. "I don't mean any harm," Ellie called out, her voice thin against the gale. "You'll freeze out here." He didn't answer. He just watched her, judging. The little girl whimpered, a sound so faint it was nearly stolen by the wind. And in that tiny sound, Ellie saw the man's pride crack, revealing the raw desperation beneath. "My place is small," she said, the words tumbling out before she could second-guess them. "But it's warm. Please, come with me." The wind howled, a physical barrier between them. Then slowly, the man rose. He lifted the girl into his arms, her small head lolling against his shoulder. "Thank you," he rasped, his voice raw. The small room above the general store was barely a sanctuary, but it was warm. A tiny wood stove glowed in the corner, fighting back the chill. Ellie stoked the embers, coaxing them back to life as the man stood silently by the door, the sleeping child still in his arms. He was bigger than she'd realized, his frame filling the cramped space. He moved with a quiet heaviness, like a man carrying more than just his daughter. Ellie pulled the blankets from her cot and gently wrapped them around the little girl. The child's eyes fluttered open. They were a startling hazel, full of a strange old light. "What's your name?" Ellie whispered. "Clara," the girl breathed. Her tiny cold hand fumbled in her pocket and pulled something out. A small, crudely twisted piece of copper wire, decorated with 2 colored beads. She pressed it into Ellie's hand. "For you," she murmured, before her eyes drifted shut again. A lump formed in Ellie's throat. She looked at the man, who watched the exchange with an expression she couldn't quite read. Gratitude, yes, but something else, too. Something guarded. "I'm Ellie Hayes," she offered. "Thomas," he said. Just Thomas. No last name. He said it like even that one word was a risk. He wouldn't meet her eyes. He just stared at the fire, his jaw tight. Questions swirled in Ellie's mind. Who was this man? Why was he out in a blizzard with a sick child and no name? But the look in his eyes, a look of a man pushed to the very edge, kept her silent. For tonight, it was enough that a child was warm. But as the storm raged outside, A different kind of storm was gathering in Ellie's heart. She had opened her door to strangers, risking the little she had left, and she had a terrible feeling that the man named Thomas had brought more than just the cold into her home. She put the last of her dried beans into a pot on the stove. It wouldn't be much of a meal, but it would be hot. As she stirred, she felt Thomas's eyes on her. He hadn't moved from his chair by the fire, where Clara slept against his chest. The silence in the room was thick, broken only by the crackle of the flames and the moan of the wind. Finally, he spoke. "You didn't have to do this." His voice was low and gravelly. "Neither did you have to fix my water pump," she replied, nodding toward the corner. The constant, maddening drip that had kept her awake for nights was gone. He'd fixed it silently while she was tending to the fire, his large hands surprisingly deft. He almost smiled. "Old habit. Can't stand to see things broken." There was a story in those words. She knew it. A story of a life lived fixing things. But what had broken so badly in his own life that he'd ended up here? She ladled the thin soup into 3 bowls. As she handed one to him, Clara stirred. He coaxed her awake gently, his voice softening in a way that seemed at odds with his rugged face. The child took the bowl in her small hands and held it like a treasure, humming softly between spoonfuls. For a moment, it felt like they were a family, a strange, broken little family, huddled together against the storm. It was a dangerous feeling. After they ate, Clara, with a bit of warmth in her now, pulled out a small pouch filled with bits of wire and string. "I make things," she whispered to Ellie, holding up another loop of copper. "Mama taught me." Her voice caught on the word mama. She glanced at her father, who put a steadying hand on her shoulder. The mother was gone. That much was clear. Ellie accepted the new bracelet, her heart aching for the little girl. As Clara and her mother slept, Thomas moved around the small room. He didn't rest. He straightened a crooked shelf. He tightened the loose handle on a cabinet. His hands were never still, as if work was the only thing that kept the ghosts at bay. "You're good with your hands," Ellie said quietly. He grunted. Easier to mend wood than people. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. He stood abruptly and adjusted the blanket around Clara, as if he'd said too much. He insisted on sleeping on the floor by the stove, a silent guardian. As Ellie lay on the cot, she listened to the rhythm of their breathing, a fragile peace in the heart of the storm. But she couldn't shake the feeling of dread. This man was not a simple drifter. He was hiding something. And as the wind clawed at the shutters, Ellie wondered if she had just sheltered a man from the storm or invited a much more dangerous one inside. The first thing Ellie noticed when she woke was the silence. The storm had broken, leaving the world hushed and white. The second thing she noticed was the emptiness. Thomas and Clara were gone. The blanket on the floor was neatly folded. The cot where Clara had slept was smoothed over. It was as if they had never been there. A cold dread, colder than the frost on the window pane, washed over her. On the table lay a single, folded piece of paper. It wasn't a note. It was a drawing. A child's crayon drawing of 3 stick figures holding hands under a sky full of yellow stars. A tall man, a little girl, and a woman with long hair. A family. Underneath, in a man's steady hand, were 2 words. "Thank you." The drawing should have been a comfort. Instead, it was a punch to the gut. They had vanished without a goodbye, leaving behind only a picture of a life she'd briefly touched. The warmth of the previous night was gone, replaced by a profound, aching loneliness. The room felt bigger, colder. Her mother's weak cough from the next room shattered the quiet. Ellie pushed her own feelings down and hurried to her side. "You look pale, child," her mother whispered, her voice frail. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Mama," Ellie lied, her throat tight. She spent the rest of the day trudging through the snow-clogged streets of Helena searching for work. At the bank, the manager looked at her calloused hands and sneered. "We need someone with a mind for figures, not for laundry." At the post office, the clerk laughed. "You think you can heft a mailbag, little lady?" Each rejection was another door slammed shut, another reminder of how precarious her world was. By nightfall, she was back in her empty room, the last of her mother's medicine in her hand. The bottle was almost dry. That's when her mother began to cough again, a deep, rattling sound that shook her whole body. The doctor came, his beard dusted with snow, his eyes full of tired pity. He examined her mother for a long time. "It's her lungs," he said finally, his voice grave. "She needs care I can't give her here. There's a sanatorium out east. It's her only real chance." A sanatorium. The word alone sounded expensive, impossible. A mountain of cost she had no way to climb. The doctor left, and Ellie sat by the stove, the silence pressing in on her. She took out the drawing and traced the stick figures with her finger. "Why did you leave?" she whispered to the empty room. "What were you running from?" She tucked the drawing into her family Bible, a place for things precious and lost. As she lay in bed that night listening to the wind, she couldn't shake the image of Thomas's steel-gray eyes. His absence was a physical ache, heavier than any of her other worries, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that their story wasn't over. Fate had thrown them together for a reason, and the same fate that had brought them to her door would surely bring them back. She just didn't know if it would be for good or for ill. The letter arrived a week later. It was on thick, expensive paper, sealed with a red wax stamp of a mountain range and the initials, SR. Silver Ridge Mining Company, the richest, most powerful company in the territory. Her name, Miss Ellie Hayes, was written in a crisp, unfamiliar hand. The letter was short and to the point. Her presence was requested at the Silver Ridge office. Noon tomorrow. A matter of importance. Ellie's hands trembled as she read it. It had to be a mistake. What business could the great Silver Ridge Mining have with a jobless woman living above a general store? She showed it to her mother, whose eyes widened. "Be careful, child," she warned. "Men of power don't summon women of our station for charity." The next day, Ellie wore her only good skirt and her father's old shawl, the copper bracelet from Clara still on her wrist. The Silver Ridge office loomed over the town, a monument of timber and glass. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of leather and cigar smoke. A stern-faced secretary led her down a long, paneled hallway to a massive oak door. She took a deep breath and stepped inside, and the world tilted on its axis. Behind the enormous desk, looking out of place in a fine wool suit, sat Thomas. It took her a moment to reconcile the rugged, desperate man from the storm with the powerful figure in front of her. But the eyes were the same, steel gray, weary, and now appraising her with an unreadable expression. "You," she breathed, the single word a mix of shock and accusation. "Miss Hayes," he said, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of something she couldn't name. "Please, sit." She sat stiffly, her mind racing. The threadbare coat, the desperate flight through the snow. It was all a lie, a charade. "I owe you an explanation," he began. "That night, I wasn't lost. Not in the way you thought. My company, my life, was being threatened. I had to disappear for a time to see who my true enemies were. I needed to look like a man with nothing." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "But I also needed to see if there was any good left in this town. You opened your door to a beggar and his child. You gave us your last bit of food. You expected nothing in return." He paused. "That's why you're here. I'm offering you a position at Silver Ridge." Ellie stared at him, speechless. "A position doing what?" she finally managed to ask. "I'm not a bookkeeper. I have enough bookkeepers," he said. "I need something more. I need a heart. My miners work in dangerous conditions. Their families struggle. This company has taken so much from this mountain. It's time it gave something back. I want you to run a new department, a welfare program for our workers and their families." The offer was staggering, impossible. "I can't," she whispered. "The other managers, the foreman, they'll never accept me. They'll say I'm just here because you pity me." "Let them talk," Thomas said, his voice hard as granite. "I saw your strength that night. It's not in a title or a bank account. It's in your character. It's the kind of strength this company desperately needs." He was offering her a lifeline. More than that, he was offering her a purpose. The money could save her mother, but the job could save a part of herself she thought was long dead. She thought of the whispers, the scorn she would face. Then she looked at the copper bracelet on her wrist, a gift given in desperation, a symbol of a choice she had made in the dark. She stood up, her legs unsteady. "I'll try," she said, her voice barely a whisper. A flicker of relief crossed his face. "Good," he said. "You won't be alone in this." As she walked out of the opulent office and back into the muddy streets, Ellie felt like she was walking between two worlds. She had been given a chance she never could have imagined. But she knew, with a chilling certainty, that accepting Thomas's offer had not saved her from the storm. It had placed her directly in its eye, and the whispers had already begun. The mining camp was a world of its own, a sprawling collection of bunkhouses and workshops carved into the mountainside, thick with the smell of coal smoke and sweat. When Ellie arrived for her first day, the miners stopped and stared. Their faces were grim, coated in dust, their eyes full of suspicion. A woman in a clean dress didn't belong here. Her new office was a small, dusty room next to the company store. Thomas had given her a title, Director of Community Welfare, and a budget, but he hadn't given her a map for the wilderness of mistrust she now faced. The other managers treated her with a cold, formal politeness that was worse than open hostility. They saw her as the boss's charity case, a foolish, sentimental woman playing at business. She started by walking the camp, not as a manager, but as a listener. She spoke to the miners' wives, women with hands as chapped as her own, who told her about the constant fear of cave-ins and the lung sickness that took their husbands too soon. She saw children playing in the dirt with no school to go to, their futures as bleak as the slag heaps that surrounded them. She saw the bunkhouses, cramped and airless, where dozens of men slept in shifts. She didn't make grand promises. She started small. She used her budget to set up a soup kitchen near the mine entrance, offering a hot meal to men coming off a long shift. She hired a retired school teacher to hold lessons for the children in the afternoons. She arranged for a doctor to make weekly visits to the camp, offering basic medical care. At first, the people were wary, but slowly, a few began to trust her. A young wife whose husband had broken his leg in a shaft collapse came to her in tears, and Ellie used the fund Thomas had given her to make sure their rent was paid. An old miner, his lungs rattling with dust, finally agreed to see the doctor. Small victories, but with every victory, the whispers in town grew louder. McGrow's pet project. Wasting company money on handouts. She'll be the ruin of Silver Ridge. The words followed her like a shadow. One evening, as she was leaving the camp, the foreman, a hard-faced man named Silas, blocked her path. "You think a little soup and some books are going to change anything, missy?" He sneered, his breath smelling of whiskey. "These men need grit, not charity. You're making them soft." His eyes were cold and menacing. For a moment, Ellie was terrified. She was alone, far from the main office. But then she thought of the young wife who had clung to her hand, the relief in her eyes. She thought of the children learning to read. She straightened her shoulders. "Strength isn't about being hard, Silas," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "It's about taking care of your own. And these people are my own now." He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "We'll see how long that lasts when the real wolves come to the door." He let her pass, but his threat hung in the air. That night, she found a dead rat left on the doorstep of her office. A clear, vile warning. She was starting to make a difference, and that meant she was also starting to make enemies. Very dangerous enemies. Thomas found her the next morning, her face pale, but her jaw set. He saw the remains of the rat in the trash bin. He didn't have to ask. "This is Silas's work," he said, his voice a low growl. "I'll fire him." "No," Ellie said, surprising herself with her own firmness. "If you do that, it will only prove what they're saying, that I'm just a woman who needs you to fight her battles. I have to handle this myself." He looked at her, a flicker of admiration in his steel-gray eyes. That afternoon, a shipment of new blankets arrived for the bunkhouses, paid for by the welfare fund. As the men were lining up to get them, Silas swaggered over. "Look at this," he bellowed. "The boss's lady turning you all into pampered children. A real miner sleeps in the cold and likes it." The men shuffled their feet, their expressions a mix of resentment and fear. No one wanted to cross the foreman. Ellie stepped forward, her heart pounding. "These blankets aren't a gift, Silas," she said, her voice clear and carrying. "They're an investment. A man who sleeps warm works safer. A man who isn't sick with a chill doesn't make mistakes that could get his crew killed." She looked from Silas to the faces of the miners. "This program isn't about making you soft. It's about keeping you alive." A tense silence fell over the camp. Then, one of the oldest miners, a man named Jed, stepped forward and took a blanket. "She's right," he said, his voice raspy. "I lost my brother in a cave-in because a man next to him was half asleep from a fever. I'll take the blanket." One by one, the other men followed, each taking a blanket and giving Silas a hard look as they passed. The foreman was left standing alone, his face flushed with fury. He had lost, and he knew it. That evening, Thomas was waiting for her outside the office. He didn't say anything. He just handed her a small, paper-wrapped object. Inside was a simple wooden carving of a bird, its wings outstretched. "Clara wanted you to have it," he said. "She says you're teaching the whole town how to fly." The simple gift, the simple words, broke through the wall of fear and exhaustion she'd been building all day. Tears welled in her eyes. "They hate me," she whispered. "Some of them do," he said, his voice gentle. "Because you're changing things, and change is terrifying. But the ones who matter, they're starting to see the truth." He took a step closer. The air between them crackled. "You're the strongest person I've ever met, Ellie Hayes." Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the twilight, the wooden bird clutched in her hand. She had won a small battle, but Silas's words echoed in her mind. The real wolves are coming. She had a sinking feeling he was right. The fight for the soul of Silver Ridge had only just begun. The first of the real wolves arrived on the noon train. They wore expensive Eastern suits and polished boots that seemed offended by Helena's mud. They were from a company called Orion Capital, a name that was whispered like a curse in mining towns from Colorado to California. Orion didn't build mines. It consumed them, buying them out, stripping them of their assets, and leaving behind ghost towns and broken men. They walked into the Silver Ridge office as if they already owned it. Their leader, a man named Sterling with cold, dead eyes, slid a contract across Thomas's desk. It was an offer to buy Silver Ridge outright, a generous offer, on paper. The company's other shareholders, nervous men who cared more for their portfolios than for the miners, urged Thomas to take it. "It's a fortune, McGraw. You'd be a fool to refuse. Thomas didn't even look at the numbers. He looked at Sterling. Silver Ridge is not for sale. Sterling's smile was thin and sharp, like a razor. Everything is for sale, Mr. McGraw. It's just a matter of finding the right price, or applying the right pressure. It was a threat, plain and simple, and Orion started applying pressure immediately. Suddenly, Silver Ridge's shipments were being delayed at the rail yard. The bank that held Thomas's loans started making nervous inquiries, and the rumors in town, once just saloon gossip, turned vicious. They said Thomas was mismanaging the company, that his welfare programs were bankrupting them, that he was a weak fool being led around by a woman. The pressure was immense. The shareholders were on the verge of revolt, ready to force a sale. Ellie watched Thomas stand against the storm, his face etched with strain, but his resolve unbroken. She knew she had to do something. She couldn't fight Orion with money or power, but she had something they didn't. She had the truth. She worked late into the nights, poring over the records she had been keeping. She compiled figures showing that since her programs had started, accidents in the mine had decreased by 30%. Production was actually up, because the men were healthier and morale was better. She gathered written testimonies from the miners' wives, heartbreaking stories of how the company's help had saved their families from starvation. One night she was working alone in her office, the lamp burning low, when she heard a floorboard creak outside. She froze. The camp was dark and silent. She held her breath, listening. The door handle began to turn, slowly, silently. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She grabbed the heaviest thing on her desk, a thick ledger book, and flattened herself against the wall beside the door. The door swung open. A large shadow fell across the floor. She lifted the ledger, ready to swing. Ellie! It was Thomas's voice. Relief washed over her so intensely her knees went weak. "What are you doing here?" she gasped. "I saw your light on. I was worried." He saw the terror on her face, the ledger in her hand. His own face hardened. "It's gotten that bad, hasn't it?" She nodded, her voice trembling. "They're trying to scare me, to scare everyone." He stepped inside and closed the door, his presence filling the small, dark room. "Orion plays dirty. They'll do whatever it takes to break us." He looked at the papers spread across her desk. "What is all this?" "It's our weapon," she said, her courage returning. "It's proof. Proof that what we're doing here isn't weakness. It's strength. We just have to make people see it." He picked up one of the testimonies, his eyes scanning the handwritten page. When he looked up, his expression was one of profound respect. "They're not just trying to take my mine, are they?" he said quietly. "They're trying to destroy everything you've built." "Then we can't let them win," she whispered. In the flickering lamplight, surrounded by the stories of the people she had fought for, a silent pact was formed between them. This was no longer just about a company. It was about a community. It was about their home, and they would defend it, together, no matter the cost. But they were about to discover that Orion Capital's definition of whatever it takes was far more ruthless than they could ever imagine. The attack came not at the mine, but at the heart of Ellie's life. Her mother. The sanatorium out east sent a letter. Due to a sudden and unforeseen increase in operating costs, they were doubling their fees, effective immediately. If the new amount wasn't paid within the week, her mother would be sent home. Ellie stared at the letter, the words blurring through a haze of panic. The new fee was an impossible sum. It was a death sentence. She knew with a sick certainty that this was Orion's doing. Sterling had found her weakness and was pressing on it with surgical cruelty. She ran to Thomas, the letter shaking in her hand. He read it, and a cold, dangerous fury settled in his eyes. "This is Sterling's work," he growled. "He's bought them." He started pacing the office like a caged lion. "I'll pay it. I'll sell off some of my personal assets. Land." "No," Ellie said, her voice quiet but firm. That's what he wants. He wants you to bleed yourself dry, to weaken your position. This isn't just about my mother. It's an attack on you. Through me. She looked him in the eye. We have to fight back, not just react. But how? They were trapped. Orion had all the money, all the power. That night, Ellie couldn't sleep. She sat by her cold stove, the sanatorium's letter on the table in front of her. She felt a despair so deep it was like drowning. She had tried so hard, fought so fiercely, but the wolves were still at the door, and they were about to tear everything down. She fiddled with the copper bracelet Clara had given her, the first one. She traced the crude wire with her thumb. It was just a child's trinket. But it was the beginning of everything. A strange thought struck her. Clara had said her mother taught her to make things. Where had a poor, transient woman gotten copper wire? On a hunch, she took the bracelet to Jed, the old miner who had been the first to support her. He was a rockhound, his small shack filled with interesting stones and bits of metal he'd found over the years. He turned the bracelet over in his gnarled hands, peering at it through a small magnifying glass. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. "This ain't common copper. See that greenish tint? And how soft it is? This comes from a very specific vein. There's only one place around here that produces ore like this." He looked up at her, his eyes sharp. "The old Black Creek claim, up past the ridge. Been abandoned for years." A jolt went through Ellie. The Black Creek claim. That was the first piece of land Thomas had ever bought. He'd told her he'd sold it years ago, before starting Silver Ridge, because it had proven worthless, but someone had been getting copper from it. She didn't know what it meant, but it was a loose thread, and she was desperate enough to pull it. The next morning, she told Thomas she needed to visit a sick miner's family and borrowed a horse. Instead, she rode up into the hills toward the abandoned Black Creek claim. The mine was just as Jed had described, a collapsed entrance, rotting timbers, a place long forgotten. But as she circled the area, she saw something. Faint tracks, nearly overgrown, leading away from the mine and into a dense thicket of trees. She dismounted and followed them on foot. The trail ended at a small, hidden cabin she never would have found otherwise. The chimney was cold, but the place had been used recently. The door was unlocked. Her hand shaking, she pushed it open and stepped inside. The cabin was sparse, but on a small wooden table was a box. And inside that box were spools of copper wire, identical to the one on her wrist. There were also letters, dozens of them, letters written in a delicate feminine hand, letters from a woman named Eleanor to a man named Thomas. Love letters. And they were all signed, "Your loving wife, Eleanor McGraw." The air rushed from Ellie's lungs. Thomas's wife wasn't dead. She was alive. And he had lied about it. The happy family in Clara's drawing, the tall man, the little girl, the woman with long hair. It was real. And Ellie was not part of it. The betrayal was a physical blow. The trust she had built with him, the unspoken bond she thought they shared. It all crumbled to dust. He had used her. He had let her believe she was becoming part of his life, part of his family, while his real family was hidden away in the hills. She backed out of the cabin, her mind reeling. Why the lie? Why the elaborate deception? As she stumbled back toward her horse, she saw something else glinting in the dirt near the cabin's foundation. She bent down and picked it up. It was a man's cufflink, engraved with a single stylized S. For Sterling. And suddenly the pieces clicked into place, forming a picture more terrifying than she could have imagined. This wasn't just about a corporate takeover. This was personal. Sterling wasn't just after Thomas's mine. He was after his wife. The letters, the hidden cabin, Thomas's lies. It was all connected. Thomas wasn't just a mine owner fighting for his company. He was a husband fighting for his family, using a lie as his only shield. But what was the nature of that fight? And why was she now standing in the middle of it? She got on her horse and rode back to Helena, not as a welfare director, but as a woman who had stumbled into a web of secrets and lies, where a single wrong move could get them all killed. She had to confront Thomas. But she had to be careful, because she no longer knew who the real enemy was. She found Thomas in his office, staring out the window at the distant mountains, his shoulders slumped with the weight of the world. She placed the cufflink on his desk without a word. The silence was deafening. He looked at the cufflink, then at her face, and he saw that she knew. All the fight went out of him. He sank into his chair and buried his face in his hands. "Her name is Eleanor," he said, his voice muffled. "She's not dead." He told her everything. Eleanor was the daughter of Orion Capital's founder. She had fallen in love with Thomas, a young, ambitious miner, and defied her family to marry him. But Sterling, her cousin, had been obsessed with her for years. When her father died, Sterling took over Orion and used its power to try and crush Thomas, to force Eleanor to come back to him. The Black Creek claim wasn't worthless. It held a unique copper deposit, but more than that, it was the first place Thomas and Eleanor had called home. After a series of threats from Sterling grew more violent, Thomas had staged Eleanor's death in a supposed carriage accident. He moved her to the hidden cabin, a place only he knew where she could be safe while he fought Sterling. Clara was their secret, the one pure thing in their lives. The night of the storm, he hadn't been running from enemies. He had been on his way back from visiting Eleanor when the blizzard hit, trapping him and Clara in town. He couldn't go to the hotel, couldn't risk being seen, so he'd hidden in the shadows, a desperate man trying to protect his daughter. "I never meant to lie to you, Ellie," he said, his voice raw with anguish. "But my life was already a lie. Bringing you into it, it was selfish. But I was drowning, and you were the first person who offered me a hand." The story was wild, unbelievable. But she knew it was true. It explained everything: his guardedness, his sadness, the way he looked at Clara. The betrayal she had felt began to fade, replaced by a wave of empathy. He wasn't a liar. He was a prisoner. "Sterling knows where she is, doesn't he?" she asked quietly, pointing to the cufflink. "He's been there. He's taunting you." Thomas nodded, his face grim. "He's closing in. He sent that letter about your mother. He's trying to isolate me, to make me desperate enough to make a mistake." He looked up at her, his eyes full of despair. "He's going to win, Ellie. He's going to take my company, my wife, my daughter. He's going to take everything." Ellie looked at the man in front of her, broken and defeated. She thought of the woman hidden in the woods, living in constant fear. She thought of little Clara, caught in a war she couldn't understand. And she thought of her own mother, her life hanging in the balance. Sterling thought he was fighting one man. He was wrong. He was fighting two women. And he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. "No, he's not," Ellie said, her voice ringing with a newfound strength that shocked them both. She picked up the cufflink. "He thinks he has you trapped. He thinks he's thought of everything." She looked Thomas straight in the eye. "But he hasn't thought of me." Their plan was desperate, a gamble against impossible odds. They couldn't fight Sterling with money or power, so they would have to fight him with the truth. But they needed an ally, someone with enough influence to make the truth matter. There was only one person who fit that description: Margaret Chen, the formidable widow of a railroad tycoon, a woman who had her own reasons to despise the Eastern syndicates. Rumor had it she was traveling through the territory. Finding her was their only shot. Thomas used his remaining contacts to track her to a private rail car, sidetracked in a town 2 days' ride away. It was a long shot, but Ellie had to take it. She left under the cover of darkness, telling no one where she was going. The ride was grueling, through rough country, with the constant fear that one of Sterling's men might be watching her. She found Margaret Chen in her opulent rail car, a world of velvet and polished mahogany. The widow was elegant and sharp, her eyes missing nothing. Ellie, dusty and exhausted, felt hopelessly out of place. She laid out the whole story: Thomas's secret family, Sterling's obsession, Orion's ruthless tactics, the threat against her own mother. She showed her the cufflink and the ledgers proving the success of the welfare program. She spoke with a raw, desperate honesty. When she was finished, the silence in the car was heavy. Margaret Chen studied her for a long moment. "You are asking me to risk a great deal of my own capital and reputation on the word of a man who has lied to his entire community and a woman I have never met," she said, her voice cool and even. "Why should I?" "Because it's not just about Silver Ridge," Ellie pleaded. "It's about what kind of world we want to live in. One where men like Sterling can crush anyone who stands in their way, or one where community and decency still mean something. You said you've seen what Orion does to towns. This is our chance to stop them." Margaret picked up the crude copper bracelet which Ellie had placed on the table. "This wire," she said softly. "My late husband was a geologist before he built railroads. He was fascinated by unique mineral deposits. He believed the future wasn't just in gold and silver, but in industrial metals like copper. He once showed me a sample from a survey he'd done in Montana. It looked just like this. He said the vein was small, but so pure it could be revolutionary for telegraph lines." She looked up at Ellie, a new light in her eyes. "Orion Capital tried to buy my husband's railroad. He refused. A month later, he was dead in a Colorado avalanche that the locals said was no accident. I believe Sterling had him killed." The pieces of the puzzle slammed together. This wasn't just about Eleanor. It was about the Black Creek claim. It wasn't worthless. It was priceless. And Sterling wanted it all. "Mr. McGraw's deceptions are regrettable," Margaret said, her voice now cold as steel. "But Mr. Sterling's crimes are unforgivable. You have my support, Miss Hayes. Tell me what you need." The town hall meeting was Sterling's idea. He had forced the vote, convinced he had broken Thomas and secured the shareholders' support. The hall was packed, the air thick with tension. Sterling and his men sat in the front row, smug and confident. Thomas stood at the podium, looking tired but resolute. Ellie sat in the crowd, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Sterling spoke first, his voice smooth and persuasive. He talked of progress, of profits, of the bright future Orion Capital would bring to Helena. He painted Thomas as a failed leader, a man driven by sentiment, who was running a noble company into the ground. It was a masterful performance. The shareholders were nodding. The townspeople looked uncertain. Then it was Thomas's turn. He walked to the podium and faced the crowd. "Mr. Sterling is right about one thing," he began, his voice quiet, but carrying to every corner of the room. "I have been driven by sentiment, and I have kept secrets from you all." A murmur went through the crowd. Sterling smiled. This was it, the final, public humiliation. "I did it to protect my family," Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger. "From this man," he pointed directly at Sterling, "a man who has been trying to destroy me for years, not to buy my company, but to steal my wife." Gasps rippled through the hall. He told them everything, the whole incredible story of his hidden wife, his secret daughter, and Sterling's relentless, obsessive persecution. Sterling leaped to his feet. "This is slander, the ravings of a desperate man." But before he could say more, the main doors of the town hall swung open. A woman stood there, poised and elegant, her dark hair streaked with silver. Margaret Chen. "It is not slander, Mr. Sterling," she announced, her voice ringing with authority as she walked down the aisle. "It is the truth." The crowd parted before her like the sea. "I have spent the last year investigating the business practices of Orion Capital. My husband believed you were criminals. He was right." She produced a sheaf of papers. "Affidavits, bank records, proof that Orion has systematically used extortion, sabotage, and intimidation to destroy its competitors." She turned to the crowd. "And I am now the second largest shareholder in the Silver Ridge Mining Company. My shares are not for sale. I vote with Mr. McGraw." The hall erupted. Sterling's face was a mask of fury. "This changes nothing. You still don't have the votes." "Perhaps not," said a new voice. Ellie stood up. All eyes turned to her. Her voice trembled, but she did not back down. "But what about the charge of murder?" Sterling paled. "This is insane." "Is it?" Ellie asked, holding up the copper bracelet. This bracelet was made from copper from the Black Creek claim. The same claim Mr. Chen was surveying before his convenient accident. The same claim you have been secretly and illegally trying to acquire through shell corporations for the last 5 years. She held up the cufflink. "And is this your cufflink, Mr. Sterling? The one you dropped when you went to threaten a defenseless woman hidden in the woods?" The town sheriff, who had been standing at the back of the room, began to move slowly forward. Sterling was trapped. The web of lies he had woven for years was unraveling all around him. He made a desperate move, pulling a small derringer from his coat pocket and grabbing the nearest person as a shield. That person was Ellie. He pressed the cold barrel of the gun to her temple. The crowd screamed. "Nobody move!" Sterling snarled, dragging Ellie toward the door. "We're leaving!" But he hadn't counted on Thomas. With a roar of pure rage, Thomas launched himself across the stage, tackling Sterling in a blur of motion. The gun went off, the shot deafening in the enclosed space. For a heart-stopping second, the world stood still. Then the smoke cleared. Sterling was on the ground, pinned beneath Thomas, the gun skittering across the floor. Ellie was on her knees, her hand pressed to her side, a dark stain spreading across the fabric of her dress. She had been hit. The last thing she saw before the world went black was Thomas's horrified face leaning over her, his voice calling her name. The world came back to her in pieces, the smell of antiseptic, the murmur of voices, the feeling of a soft bed. She opened her eyes. She was in a clean, bright room. Thomas was asleep in a chair by her bed, his head in his hands. His face was haggard, his clothes rumpled. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. A small hand touched her arm. She turned her head. Clara was standing there, her hazel eyes wide with worry. "Are you flying with the angels now, Mama Earth?" she whispered. Tears filled Ellie's eyes. She squeezed the little girl's hand. "No, sweetheart. I'm right here." Thomas's head snapped up. He rushed to her side, his face a mess of relief and guilt. "Ellie, you're awake." He told her she'd been unconscious for 3 days. The bullet had gone clean through her side. It had been close. Very close. He also told her what had happened after she collapsed. The sheriff had arrested Sterling and his men. Margaret Chen's evidence, combined with Thomas's testimony and the attempted murder in the town hall, was more than enough. The Orion capital empire was crumbling. The sanatorium in the east, fearing its connection to Orion would be exposed, had sent a telegram stating that there had been a clerical error and that her mother's care would be continued at the original price indefinitely. The town had rallied around them. The miners had stood guard outside the doctor's office around the clock. The women had brought food and kept a constant vigil. The community she had fought so hard to build had, in turn, saved her. A few days later, when she was strong enough to sit up, another visitor came. A woman with kind eyes and the same hazel-brown hair as Clara, Eleanor McGraw. She took Ellie's hand, her touch gentle. "There are no words to thank you," she said, her voice soft. "You saved my family. You saved all of us." There was no jealousy in her eyes, only a profound, heartfelt gratitude. Ellie realized then that she hadn't taken this woman's place. She had made a new one for herself, a place that had never existed before. The 3 of them, Thomas, Eleanor, and Ellie, had become the strangest, most unlikely of families, bound together by a crisis that had nearly destroyed them all. Spring came to Helena, washing the grimy snow from the streets and bringing the scent of pine and wet earth. Life began to return to normal, but it was a new normal, a better one. With Margaret Chen's backing, Silver Ridge was more secure than ever. The welfare programs Ellie had started became a model for other companies in the territory. Thomas, no longer living a life of lies, was a changed man. The weariness in his eyes was replaced by a deep, quiet joy. He and Eleanor and Clara were finally a family in the light of day, and Ellie was a part of it. She continued her work at the mine, no longer the boss's charity case, but a respected leader in her own right. She had her own small house near Thomas and Eleanor's, and most nights they all had dinner together. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley, she was sitting on her porch. Thomas came and sat beside her. They sat in a comfortable silence for a long time. "I never properly thanked you, Ellie," he said finally. "You saved more than my company. You saved me." She just smiled. "We saved each other." He took her hand. His other hand went to his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a ring, not with a diamond, but with a simple polished piece of that unique green-tinted copper from the Black Creek claim. "This isn't a proposal," he said quickly, a faint blush on his cheeks. "Eleanor and our love is real, but it was forged in a difficult time. We are rediscovering what it means to be a family. But you are also our family. This ring is a promise, from all of us. A promise that you will never be alone again, that you will always have a home here, with us." Tears streamed down Ellie's face as he slid the ring onto her finger. It wasn't the future she had ever imagined for herself, but it was more beautiful and more real than any dream. She had started out with nothing, a lone woman against a blizzard, and now she had everything, a purpose, a community, a family. She had faced down the wolves and won, not with wealth or power, but with a stubborn belief in the power of kindness. And in the Montana twilight, surrounded by the mountains that had once seemed so menacing, she was finally, truly home. What do you think makes someone a hero? Is it a single act of bravery, or a lifetime of quiet decency? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more tales of the unexpected.